So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight and bring to you Andrew O'Shaughnessy, and I think he has an outstanding lecture to give to you tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, George, for that lovely introduction. It's really a privilege to be here as part of the Drayton Hall Distinguished Lecture Series. I want to thank the intermediaries at Drayton Hall, Tara White, I don't know if she's here, Steve McLeod, and also your archaeologist, Sarah Stroud-Clark, who has worked closely with our archaeology, and I think may be the reason that I'm here tonight. I am, of course, going to be speaking about the other side of the American Revolution. It's wonderful to do it here in Charleston, in addition to our friends at Drayton Hall, which I think of as really the most magnificent home in colonial America. Bravo. I don't compare it. I exclude Monticello because Monticello was built in the 1790s, so we're not in competition. And I have to say that every time that I've been in Charleston, I've been here without a car. So tomorrow I'm going to get to see it for the first time, and I'm very excited because it's always been almost at the top of my to-do list. And I'd also just like to recognize in the audience this evening some special friends. I particularly want to acknowledge Jim Breeden, who was actually the person who first hired me to come and work in America. Jim, who's sitting on the front row and will not really want to be subject to this, but he hired me to come as a one-year lecturer to SMU back in 1989, and I'm still here. The idea was to come here a year, get knowledge of teaching American history in America, and go straight back to Britain. And I'd also like to thank my friend John and also Diane Culhane, who were my hosts for the last two evenings. So this is about the other side of the American Revolution. I want to start with a slightly frivolous comparison of the American and British covers of this book. This is the US cover, and I do incidentally recommend the US edition because it has color illustrations. So I was thrilled with Yale. An author should never make claims for their book, but I can make one claim, that there is no book on the American Revolution with more red-colored plates than this one. But the picture on the front is the same as the painting on the front of the British edition. It's by the American artist John Singleton Copley, and it actually depicts a British victory. Oddly enough, the British never commissioned someone like John Trumbull to record their defeat in the American Revolution. There are a few pictures that I managed to find, but there are very few done by Britain depicting what was happening in America, and most date from New York in 1776 when they thought they were about to win. So this is actually Gibraltar. It's known as the Floating Batteries of Gibraltar, and in some ways that painting reinforces this particular angle. The full painting is almost the size of a wall. These are life-size figures. It's like a mural. And the chances are you've never seen it before, because this painting during the Second World War was sent to Gibraltar for safekeeping and stayed there 40 years. It then returned to the Guildhall Museum of Art, which is probably an art museum you didn't go to while you were in London. It's not the first place you'd go, although I do recommend that this was the City of London's art collection, and it's still one of the major financial centers in the world. It certainly was in the 18th and 19th century. They have a very good art collection. It's worth seeing. But the angle they've taken really reinforces what I think is the stereotype of British leadership in this period. An arrogant, haughty British officer pointing into the distance. And there's a lot of my friends who created a story when they saw this cover. And they said the junior officer looks as though he's looking at, it's actually Augustus Eliot in Gibraltar, and saying, "What are you thinking about? Are you being serious?" You have someone being crucified in the bottom left-hand corner. You have my full name with my middle name, Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy. Jackson was actually my mother's maiden name, but I don't want to disappoint you. My parents are Americophiles. There's no such word, but there should be, because just as there are Anglophiles in this country, there are people who adore America in Britain. They, in fact, now live in Florida against my wife's advice. They, of course, were incredibly grateful for America's intervention in World War II. My father had read the Schlesinger biography of Jackson. It's very uncomplicated. It says nothing about Indian removal. This is when good guys and bad guys were very easy to separate. And for him, Jackson was just a blunt exponent of democracy, studied American government in college, and so he was very fond of Andrew Jackson and knew what happened when you juxtaposed the two names. The subtitle is different in the British edition. So just to remember, this says British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of Empire. So here's the British edition. And it's the same painting, but the camera has gone back. The guy being crucified in the corner has disappeared. And you have this virtual rugby scrum of redcoats looking very triumphant. This was actually commemorating a moment during the American Revolution in which the British withstood the longest siege of the British Army in its history. It was a 4-year siege by France and Spain, and the British were victorious. There were British victories during the American Revolution, and this war was a global war. It's part of the theme of the book. But as you see, this is commemorating a victory. And one of the things you very quickly learn about the historical record is that people commemorate their successes, not their defeats. It only has my first and second name. The British publisher said to me that they were very worried that if they put the middle name in, people might think I was American. And because the British do not use middle names. It always intrigues them that someone like Harry Truman created a middle initial for his name because he felt he had to have a middle name. And then the subtitle is different. Instead of British Leadership, it's British Command. And that has a slightly different tone to it. And instead of the fate of the empire, it's the preservation of the empire. In fact, they wanted me to avoid even calling it The Men Who Lost America and having something much more upbeat. But of course, this is a book about a war in which Britain essentially failed, one of the very few in the 18th century. And it's a war seemingly Britain should have won. And so the main question in this book is, why did Britain fail? Now, traditionally, the belief is that they failed because of poor leadership. That's one of the most common layman views, and I'm going to show you a bit later. In the popular media, in popular history like Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly, she devotes a third of that book to what she thinks is the stupidity, aristocratic buffoonery of the British during the Revolution. So I begin this book by looking at the 10 most prominent leaders. These are the political and the military leadership. It's very important to include the political because generals, as today, do not make a decision in a vacuum. They are under political pressure. And I tried to set it up like a play, to introduce these people at the point at which they are important. The disadvantage is that there's going to be some overlap, but even that can be an advantage because each of these individuals sees this war from a different perspective. It reinforces some of the themes. So they essentially come onto the stage at the point where they are key to the decision making. Obviously, I had to have George III. That would perhaps be the first name that would occur to people. I originally thought I was going to write this chapter last. I thought this is going to be the least interesting chapter to do. It was actually one of the most interesting chapters, and it was the one that I wrote first, and I even did it as an academic article in a journal, because a lot of what I thought I knew about George III I had to throw out. And the idea that he was the man who had precipitated the revolution proved certainly not to be the case. He'd had very little influence on British policy in America before the Boston Tea Party. Most of those policies were devised by ministers, which he appointed, but he didn't tell them what to do, what to think. And they had to be ministers who had the support of the majority of the House of Commons. However, you can keep him as your villain, because after the Boston Tea Party, George III became absolutely obsessed with America. In fact, he was so obsessed that he wanted to continue the war for America after the Battle of Yorktown. The reason that he was obsessed is he believed if Britain lost America, it would cease to be a great power. This is George III at the height of the war in 1779, when he was almost his own prime minister. At this point, the government was falling apart. At some stage, the prime minister had said he wanted to resign. The commander-in-chief had said he wanted to resign. The deputy, second in command in America, had also said he wanted to resign. George III was the driving force. In fact, he wrote a letter that I used as the heading for the article that I did on him, saying, "If others will not be active, I must drive." He took the unprecedented action, at least since the reign of Queen Anne at the beginning of the century, of calling the entire cabinet to his personal home, which is now Buckingham Palace, but was then the Queen's house. And he took them to the library, and he asked them all to sit down, which was highly informal, really unknown. And he then proceeded to give them a pep talk. They thought they were all about to be sacked. And instead, he didn't harangue them, he didn't shout at them. It was really the kind of talk that a coach might give to a team. He said, "We're in this together. We made an error. We probably wouldn't now have proceeded with the Stamp Act and the taxes of America." He said, "We chose the generals that we thought were the best. We're now about to fight a war with Spain as well. We must go on." At times, George III, and this was a point made by a historian in a highly academic book written just after the Second World War, but someone who'd lived through the Second World War, Herbert Butterfield of Cambridge University. And he said, George III sounded like Churchill. He would make statements like, "If any 10 men will stand beside me, I intend to go on." George III twice wrote out his abdication speech. He was determined that if his own government wasn't willing to continue the war, he wasn't willing to be King of England. He thought any Englishman a traitor who would even consider not fighting for America. So I want to dispel at least one myth that I think is actually stronger on the other side of the Atlantic than this, that the British never took this war seriously. This is one of the longest wars in British and American history, and they were determined to get America back. Now, the person who was responsible for the policies that at least triggered the war, although he inherited a revolutionary climate in America. The day he was appointed Prime Minister, Lord North, was the day of the Boston Massacre. So he inherited a revolutionary situation. But Lord North today is known as the worst Prime Minister in British history. And it is entirely because he lost America. It was particularly popular during the Macmillan period in England in the early 60s to get up and accuse the Prime Minister of being the worst Prime Minister since Lord North. But it's been a regular insult in England ever since. And North indeed was the person who passed the Tea Act. He was the person who created what in Britain are called the coercive acts that triggered the war, what in America and American textbooks are called the intolerable acts that really ignited all 13 colonies and led to the calling of the First Continental Congress. But again, North was a great surprise to me, because the moment that he realized that this was a united cause between all of the colonies, he started to try to backpedal. And he realized basically in December of 1774, when news arrived of the First Continental Congress, its deliberations were secret. But once people had met and they'd gone back to their states, they announced that they were going to do a blockade of Britain and the British West Indies. And so for the first time, North realized this wasn't just an argument with Massachusetts. His idea was Britain could isolate Massachusetts from the rest of the colonies and punish not only Boston, but what he thought were really the hotheads of the Revolution. The moment he realized that this was a wider conflict, he tried to get intermediaries to negotiate with Benjamin Franklin, and he made his first offer to America. It's called Lord North's Conciliatory Proposal, in which he basically offered not to tax America if the American assemblies were to tax themselves and give a certain amount of money each year for their administration and defense to Britain. What was really interesting to me is that there were lots of initiatives, lots of secret attempts to contact Congress, but his big offer came in 1778, when he knew that France was likely to come into the war. It's known as the Carlisle Commission, and he basically offered America no taxes ever, and nothing but token British government. And as long as that, they would just recognize Britain as the sort of titular ruler of America. It would essentially be self-governing. I've often wondered if you offered that today, no taxes, that there might be more takers. The great irony of the American Revolution was, first and foremost, it was a tax revolt. It had many causes, but tax really united the colonies more than any other. And yet they ended up paying more taxes within 10 years of the war than they'd ever paid to the British. And Lord North could never understand it. He said the colonists are paying 1/50th of the taxes of the average Englishman. And he couldn't understand why the Tea Act, which didn't actually increase taxes, it reduced the duty on tea and made English tea cheaper, why anyone would object and throw that tea into the harbour. North, far from emerging as a mediocrity and the worst Prime Minister, was in fact one of the greatest speakers in the House of Commons in the 18th century. He was lined up against some of the all-time greats in British history in terms of oratory and in terms of their later legacy. Charles James Fox was an opponent. So was William Pitt, both the elder and the younger. When the 24-year-old younger Pitt got up to speak and was dazzling, Edmund Burke, who was also one of these opponents, sat listening to him and said, he's not just a chip off the old block, he is the old block. And of course, Burke was one of them, the Earl of Shelburne. Today, we think a British Prime Minister admirable because they can stand up in front of C-SPAN for an hour and take questions. Lord North went into Parliament for 3 days a week. He arrived at noon. He waited till the end of the session, which was sometimes in the early hours of the morning with no recess the next day, and spoke for 2 hours without notes. The idea was literally to get the last word before the vote. He could deliver a budget speech with no notes, and in fact, it was a form of entertainment to go and hear him deliver the budget speech. Not only was he Prime Minister, but he fulfilled the role of what today is known as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He oversaw Britain's finances. And indeed, Lord North, like almost every Prime Minister of Britain in the 18th century, was first and foremost a financier, because the biggest British worry was not America in the 18th century, it was the national deficit. Britain was carrying a deficit that was much larger in terms of its tax income than the American national deficit today. And the last time I looked, the American deficit, perhaps we pay 16% of our tax income on interest on our debt. In the 18th century in Britain, they were often paying more than 50% of their tax income just servicing the debt. And remember, the whole idea of paper money, of banks, of debt was very novel in this period. People thought the country could literally capsize at any moment, and they certainly believed that the colonies were essential for keeping that debt stable. The reason the British first taxed America was because of the size of the national debt. Lord North kept Britain's finances stable throughout the war. One of the reasons he wanted to get out was he could see what it was costing Britain, and he famously said to Lord North, "The cost is exceeding the benefit." And Lord North said, "You're like a tradesman," George III said, "You're like a tradesman with his counter. You think you can just measure everything," whereas, as far as he was concerned, America had a symbolic importance beyond anything that you could measure. The fact is that France, not Britain, went bankrupt as a result of the American Revolution. You could argue that France was the greatest loser. As a result of its debts in the American Revolution, the French had to call the Estates General, which led to the French Revolution, and France came out of this war almost empty-handed. There's one chapter with two people in it, and that is the Howe brothers, who were the first real commanders in America, who took over after Bunker Hill. There is no decent portrait of Sir William Howe, unfortunately. He's the one person in the book for whom I couldn't find a painting, other than a miniature in Canada, done at the age of 21, which was clearly very different from the much more paunchy figure that arrived in his late 40s. The Howe brothers commanded the army and the navy. His brother, Lord Richard Howe, was the admiral. These are the two brothers who are thought to have lost the best opportunity to win the Revolutionary War in 1776. They sound like good old boys with two brothers commanding both forces. Sir William insisted if he took command of the army, his brother was going to command the navy. It was a natural request because the greatest problem in any military exercise is coordinating the different services. And when you had two brothers working together, coordinating the different services, clearly there was going to be much greater harmony. But far from being simply the next guys up for the job, this was not like Wingfield Scott in the Union Army at the beginning of the Civil War. They called him Old Fuss and Feathers, and he just happened to be in command. They jumped 105 generals to get Sir William Howe, and he was just William Howe at the time. He'd only been a general for 3 years. And he was chosen entirely because he'd served in America. He'd been at Britain's greatest victory almost of any war, the Plains of Abraham in Quebec and the conquest of Canada. He was Wolfe's right-hand man. And he was an expert in light infantry. The English knew this was not going to be a conventional war. They were indeed going to be fired at by people from behind trees. They were going to face what today we think of as a guerrilla war. And they sent the man who knew most about that, who developed light infantry, which were like commando units. They could break away from the regular army. They were athletic. They moved quickly. They broke formation. He even redesigned uniforms so they were shorter and they weren't being held back. And then his brother, the person who was indeed appointed by request, his brother, Lord Richard Howe, was even a bigger innovator in the British Navy. Lord Richard Howe later became Britain's leading naval hero before Nelson. He won a battle during the French Revolutionary Wars called the Glorious 1st of June. He's commemorated in medallions, in coins, in tokens, engravings, and deservedly so. This is a man who basically wrote the book and created amphibious warfare, in which the army and the navy would work together. He helped design the craft and introduce what were known as flat-bottom ships, exactly the kind of thing that we were still using on D-Day. The bow of the ship would go forward and infantry could just run off. In a single afternoon in Staten Island in early August of 1776, they landed 16,000 men and 40 cannon. It was regarded as terrifying at the time. Henry Knox, the great American artillerist who lived at number 1 Broadway, looked out of his window and said that Howe's fleet looked like a forest. You have to remember there were more British troops around New York in 1776 than the largest American city. Philadelphia was the largest city, 30,000. There were at least 35,000 men surrounding New York at the time. John Burgoyne was never commander-in-chief. He was the second most senior general after Howe. He is, of course, the person who lost Saratoga, the turning point of the war. But before the American Revolutionary War, Burgoyne was a rising star in the British Army. The whole theme of this book is that these people were really, just as a famous book done on Vietnam, some of the best and the brightest. Until this moment, their careers had progressed, not based simply on family connections, but based on genuine achievement. Burgoyne was portrayed here by Sir Joshua Reynolds. This portrait was commissioned by his commander-in-chief as a respect to him for his successful defense of Portugal against Spain during the French and Indian Army. He was someone who reflected on the nature of armies. He wrote a very important report in which he went around Europe after the French and Indian War and looked at the Austrian army, he looked at the Prussian army and the French army, looked at their strengths and weaknesses and what Britain might learn from other military. This was no fool. He was also one of the first to advocate not treating your military like slaves, but actually treating your men well and improving the condition of soldiers and paying officers a livable wage, something he was obsessed by, partly because he had to leave the army for a period because he'd gone bankrupt and he lived in France and understood that military pay was insufficient. And he otherwise would have been more senior to Sir William Howe if he hadn't done. Lord George Germain is someone who is less well known, and yet this is the British official who was most responsible for the American war in England. He was Secretary of State for America. I have to point this painting out. Not only have I worked at the desk with those silver candlesticks and inkwells in front of me, but the house in the background is called Drayton House. That was his home. And the owners of Drayton House have long sought to establish a connection with Drayton Hall. They've not found successfully a connection, but you might give them one because they're desperate. They're desperate to be associated with you. They still have his waistcoat. Germain, probably more than anyone, has been blamed for the failure because he was the coordinating figure in London throughout the war. There is only one biography, and this is the difference between, say, the study of the Confederacy during the Civil War and indeed our knowledge of the Revolution, that amazingly these key figures on the British side have hardly been studied. And the one biography of him begins, "I detest this man." And there are many reasons to dislike him. He'd been branded in a court-martial a coward. The fact is, though, he had tremendous military experience in the way that many civilian government officials often did not, especially today. And he also was a great administrator. Everybody in 1776 said this man has brought new momentum to this war. He got 35,000 men to join an existing 20,000 men in America across the Atlantic in 1776. It required every ship in the British merchant marine. He had a close office staff of only 5 and a larger department of only 25 altogether. Everything had to be done by hand orders. Everything had to be made by craftsmen. They got 35,000 men, and his idea was a knockout blow in New York against Washington and the Continental Army. He urged the army, the time was to act quick. He argued that it was cruel to drag out the war. The best thing was to defeat the Continental Army on Manhattan. Virtually every military historian since has said this was the best opportunity to win the war, and the best opportunity would have been to surround Washington on Manhattan and to defeat his army. Germain always felt that his commanders were more interested in negotiating peace than in actual winning a military victory. And this was not just true of William Howe in New York, but also Guy Carleton, the commander in Canada. Carleton simply released all the American prisoners of war in Canada in order to create goodwill. One of those prisoners he released, which the British would regret at Cowpens, was called Daniel Morgan, otherwise known as the Old Wagner, the person who, as he put it in his own words, gave Tarleton a hell of a whipping. Sir Henry Clinton, and usually I say this is one of the most unknown of the British generals. He became commander-in-chief in succession to Howe, but surely I can't say that here in Charlottesville. In Charleston, because Clinton was, of course, the one who successfully besieged it. And if Clinton had resigned immediately afterwards, as he planned to do, Clinton would have gone down as the greatest commander in America. There is only one biography again. It happens to be excellent in the way that it's written, in the detail. It won the Bancroft Prize, which is given by the American Historical Association. It's probably the last military history book to win that prize from the AHA. But it had one fatal flaw. It was written at the height of psychohistory. And when having Freudian interpretations was very popular. And so the historian William Wilcox argued that this man was a neurotic, he'd had an over-dominant mother and a distant father, which was fascinating because we know very little about his relationship with his parents. I quip in the book that it's like the old psychology joke. The good news is you are neurotic. The bad news is you've got much to be neurotic about. Clinton was being expected to win this war with fewer troops and less naval support than the Howe brothers at a time when Britain was first at war with France and then with Spain and then with Holland, and it was involved in a global war. A young captain, he happened to be the son of a former prime minister, in his early 20s, walked into Clinton's office a few days after he'd been appointed and found his commander-in-chief, and this must have been, I think, pretty emotional for a very young person. He saw his commander-in-chief with his head in his hands crying, and Clinton pointed to the sentry at the door and said, I'd rather be him than be in my shoes. Clinton immediately, he tried not to become commander-in-chief. And I describe him as the most cerebral of the British commanders because he really understood this war and understood the nature of this war. He was the son of a former governor of New York. He'd grown up in America. The family had lands in America. He knew America. He also understood, in the way few military historians have done subsequently, that the Navy was going to be the absolute key to the Revolutionary War. He understood, in the way that only Washington and Adams really did on the Patriot side, but they understood it well, that at any moment a superior French fleet off the coast of America could cut off any detachment of the British Army, isolate them, and defeat them. He basically foresaw Yorktown, and he saw at least 3 occasions before Yorktown when the combined Continental Army and French fleet could have achieved the same results. The miracle to him was how long Britain lasted, rather than the fact that Britain was ultimately defeated. But he understood something even more profound, which is a key to my interpretation in this book. He understood that this was ultimately a war of hearts and minds. And that was the phrase he used. He said, we need to win the hearts and subdue the minds of America. He was totally against a quick slash and burn policy. He was totally against fast maneuvers in which you withdrew. He argued you've got to move incrementally. You've got to take territory. You've got to build up your support. The loyalist militia are never going to be strong enough to act alone. It's exactly, in fact, the same debate that's occurred in Afghanistan and Iraq, that how far can you train civilians to defend themselves without the support of an army. Clinton understood that well. He was also, incidentally, the best read of any British Army officer in the 18th century. Ira Gruber, who teaches in Texas, in Austin, he found 40 books of notes that Clinton had taken from military manuals of military history. One of his most remarkable notes was on military history, when he said military history is far too narrow. It's always about battles. It should be about politics and geography, and it should encompass a much broader range. And finally, of course, Lord Cornwallis, of the military commanders. Again, Cornwallis was a junior commander. The 2 great battles of the American Revolution, the Battle of Saratoga, the Battle of Yorktown, were lost by junior commanders not senior commanders. The commanders-in-chief virtually never lost a battle, other than Clinton's failed attempt at his first attempt at Charleston in 1776. Someone like Howe won all his battles against Washington. The British always felt they won the majority of the battles. Cornwallis regarded Clinton in much the same way as the Union Army regarded McClellan, George B. McClellan, during the Civil War. They felt they were too conservative, too cautious. Cornwallis was determined to take the war to the front, to keep advancing. For a period in England, he became known as the Hannibal of America. He was the great star of the English hope. He was also young enough to subsequently have a successful career, the most successful career of all these people. And I stress this to emphasize the importance that the margin between success and failure is often very thin. Cornwallis was the general responsible for Britain's expansion in southern India and for giving Britain one of the most populous countries on the globe. He commanded armies far greater in size than any battle fought in America, battles in which there were elephants, battles in which there were Indian sepoys fighting alongside the British. There are two huge monuments to him in India, one of which is his burial place on the river Ganges. And the last two chapters in the book deal with the Navy, because this in many ways is the key to the final British defeat. The most unexpected of the 10 personalities is Sir George Rodney, because Rodney was the one person who emerged from this war with his reputation actually enhanced rather than compromised, because Rodney, during this war, was victorious throughout. Rodney was one of the admirals who went to relieve Gibraltar. Rodney killed or captured 3 enemy admirals during the war. What is remarkable is the 3 admirals of 3 different fleets of 3 different countries. He killed the Dutch admiral, and he captured the Spanish and French admiral. The French admiral he captured was the commander of the French fleet, who had successfully defeated the British for the first time since the 1690s at the Chesapeake Capes, making possible for Cornwallis to be blockaded and surrounded at Yorktown. But only months later, Rodney intercepted him in some French islands called the Saints, captured his battleship, captured 5 of the largest French ships, sank others. The British called it the Battle of the Saints, rather than Santis, as the French called it, and they literally portrayed Rodney as Saint Rodney. He brought de Grasse back to England. De Grasse had to kneel to George III, and essentially it forced France to make terms. So the story of the men who lost America is not just a story of defeat. It is also about the triumphalist painting you saw at the beginning, because this is a war of great victory against France. And then the very last of the personalities is the Earl of Sandwich. I don't know if the name's familiar or not, but every time you have a snack, you commemorate Sandwich, because he lived hard, worked hard, and played hard. And he would wrap meat between 2 pieces of bread. This is a man who was conducting business on Christmas days quite commonly. After Germain, he was the most blamed British official for the loss of America. They even tried to impeach him in Parliament, which would have been one of the first impeachments since possibly the 17th century. And yet Sandwich was the person in the government who'd served the longest. As he pointed out himself, he'd He'd been part running the Navy before many of them were born. He understood his naval issues, even though he's a landsman and had served in the army as a younger man. He'd always wanted to oversee the Navy. And before Lexington and Concord, he told the government to fully mobilize their Navy immediately, that this war was going to lead to a war with France, that in every war in the 18th century, they'd always been caught off guard. The British had always done very badly for the first few years, which is what happened in the French and Indian War, a series of British defeats. And he said the problem is, you lay up your ships in dry dock, you put the officers on furlough, and then it takes years to get the ships up to grade to defeat the enemy. He argued, as had generally been the case, you needed a two-power navy, a navy that could knock out France and Spain together and could combat their combined fleets. Instead of getting heard by the government, they cut the Navy. Lord North wanted to save money. He also wanted symbolically to indicate to the French that Britain was not intending to fight France. Instead of building up his Navy that might have caused an arms race with France, they would reduce it. It failed. France continued to build up its Navy. The fact is, though, by the period after Yorktown, Sandwich had almost got to the target, which is why the British Navy was able to defeat the French Navy at the end of the war. Now, I said these people have been known as figures of caricature ever since. They've often been parodied. And I may need some help with this because I'm not quite sure how to get this up. Here we are. I'd like to see if we can just show a film clip, but if not, it's not to worry. It's a film clip. You can see it on YouTube. It's called Fireworks. It's a scene from The Patriot, where they show Lord Cornwallis being more concerned about his uniform and about his dogs than winning the war. I know you'll think that's a very low cut. Mel Gibson got a lot of flack for his film on the Revolution, although I actually would argue it had the potential to be the great movie of the Revolution because of the portrayal of Tarleton, which I think is actually quite accurate, even though it upset the British at the time. He didn't burn women and children, but he was a ruthless officer who believed that the British should use a slash and burn policy in America. The real Cornwallis was the Cornwallis who burnt his baggage at Rams's Mill in North Carolina, who slept out without tents with his men, whose privates regarded him as the consummate soldier because he suffered the same deprivations as they did, and who basically said, the army is my life. This is someone who talked like Washington and Jefferson. I really just want to retire to my estates. I don't want public life. But in many ways, he was someone who became throughout his life an imperial troubleshooter. Far from being concerned with grandeur, he was the most aristocratic of all the commanders. He was an earl. And yet he was the person who most disliked pomp, which is why it's so unfair to emphasize. And he also looks as though he's at Drayton Hall, because the house, he's shown constantly in his magnificent headquarters, and there was only one house in America at the time like that, and that was Drayton Hall. On the contrary, he was in the field, marching hundreds of miles, and he suffered a sort of wanderlust. The fact is he could never just remain stationary. When he was in Ireland, he refused to live in the castle, but he lived in Phoenix Park, and he was virtually assassinated by the Irish because he was involved in putting down the Irish rebellion. He would walk unaccompanied, without security, through Phoenix Park. In India, he did away with all the ceremonial. He hated it. He was not like Sir John Mills, the British actor at the beginning of Gandhi. He didn't play on that at all. This was someone who was very much interested in the practical. And so I've given you there a sketch of the individuals. I'm going to give you just the postage stamp version of why the British lost if it wasn't for incompetent leadership. And I'm not saying that every decision was the best that could have been made. There's much in retrospect one might have done differently. The point is, though, that in terms of the information they had available, you can justify each decision. It seemed a good one at the time, and these were capable people who demonstrated their abilities in other spheres. So why did they fail? And I come back to this issue that Clinton understood. The war of hearts and minds. Essentially, the British never had real support in America. They had an army of conquest, not an army of occupation. They took every city at some point. New York, Boston, Savannah, St. Augustine, Charleston, but they never managed to occupy territory. They tried in New Jersey in the winter of 76-7. They tried in Pennsylvania in 1777. And I think the most interesting theater of the war was here in the South. When they took Charleston, they thought they had got South Carolina, and yet it all imploded, despite the fact that only a few weeks after the taking of Charleston, Cornwallis defeated much of the remnant of the Continental Army at Camden. But from that moment onwards, they faced insurgencies from people who today we think of as folk heroes, like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter. But these people were one of many. There are lots of names we don't remember. There were some 2,000 skirmishes. The reason that they thought they could and that they had the majority of support in America is that's what they were being told by Americans, by American loyalists. Like most revolutions, the American Revolution was also a civil war. And nowhere is that better demonstrated than here in the South. The Battle of the King's Mountain had only one British officer, one British soldier present. Everyone else fighting in that battle was American. It's one of the reasons why the war here in the South was so savage. If we replayed The Patriot, you would have to make sure that all of those green-coated cavalry Bannister Tarleton was speaking in American accents. The very people who helped commit atrocities at Waxhaws. They were loyalists. 19,000 Americans fought for the British during the Revolution. It may have been as much as 20% of the population supported Britain. The British even sent people over. There was one guy, Simpson, who came here to South Carolina, essentially to do an opinion poll and to see where popular opinion lay. Joseph Galloway, one of the key politicians in Philadelphia in 1775, was telling the British months before Yorktown, 4 out of 5 Americans support Britain. Much in the same way as Chalabi was telling our intelligence during the occupation of Iraq, the majority of Iraqis support America. It's almost impossible during wartime to really take a poll of opinion. The situation is fluid. People changed opinions. The British were putting hopes on what today we call the silent majority. But whenever push came to shove, the majority of the people were patriot. When Burgoyne marched down from Canada, he outnumbered Schuyler and then later Horatio Gates by 2-1. When he got to Albany, he was outnumbered by 4-1. What had happened? He said people appeared from nowhere, from New Hampshire, or what is now the state of New Hampshire. That wasn't even a state or a colony. They emerged from the woods. And he said they're like the many-headed hydra. You cut off one head, more appear. And he also said we were mistaken. And virtually every senior British officer said this by the end of the war. We mistook the ability of these people. We said they could never train to the quality of a European army. The fact is that the troops that were at Saratoga were any bit as good as the British troops. Now, there are many other reasons for failure. The fact they didn't take territory meant that they weren't able to supply themselves from America, which meant bringing 33 tons of food a day and coal and even straw from Britain. It meant relying on almost a medieval system of administration with what's today the military call a fragmented system of command. There was no overall commander of forces in either Britain or in America. Germain had no control over the Navy. But in a way, George III was right. After Yorktown, the British had not been defeated. They could have continued. They still had Charleston. They still had Savannah. They still had St. Augustine. They still had New York. They still, crucially, had Canada. There was no reason to give in. The main part of the British Army was intact. What changed was opinion in Britain. In the House of Commons, Lord North could no longer command majorities because he would not and could not give, owing to George III, an unequivocal promise that Britain was about to withdraw from America. Even army officers who are allowed to sit in the House of Commons were voting disproportionately against the war. The British were convinced that the main justification for continuing, that most Americans wanted British government, had been demonstrated to be wrong. Cornwallis even called his march north an experiment. And the experiment was to see, were there these mythical loyalists in America? But I realize I've talked just in negative terms, and I talked once to the Sons of the American Revolution, and the first hand went up, and he said, but what about sharpshooters, and what about the militia, and what about us? And it was a very valid question, because whatever the odds against the British, which I would argue were greater than we often think, and that it was a war that almost precluded their success, it was still a war that America could have lost. And that's where the traditional stories are really important. That's why Washington was right to believe that it was a miracle in some ways that they still succeeded. If his army had been captured in 1776, it's questionable whether the revolution would continue. We do have the example of civil war. The fact is that the defeat of Lee's army represented the end of the war. People did not carry on with a guerrilla warfare against the Union. There's no reason to necessarily believe that they would have done in the American Revolution. I do regard Washington as a key, and that's not because I was in Mount Vernon last week. I always say, look at who the alternatives were to Washington, who was named. At the beginning of the war, it was John Hancock, who was almost a dilettante, wealthy guy in Boston, who only participated once in command at Newport, in which he became a laughingstock. The other commander was Horatio Gates. Interestingly, his other rivals were both British and former British officers. Gates was the man who commanded at Camden and then rode on horseback 150 miles from the battlefield, provoking a very uncharitable comment by Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, who said that was quite a pace for a man of his age. And the other one was Charles Lee, who I feel we were discussing before the lecture, known as Boiling Water Lee by the Indians. Now, John Shai, who's the historian's historian, the guy West Point always chose to talk about the American Revolution, he said Lee was the great mind and actually had the smartest strategy of just fighting a guerrilla war. There's no doubt of his originality, but just imagine boiling water Lee trying to deal with the finesse of politics with Congress. Washington was not only a gifted military, but he was a gifted politician. But even more importantly, Washington recognized that what was important was that a valid form of American society survived this war. Most revolutions become civil wars. Most of them degenerate into anarchy, which is what has been happening in the Arab Spring, and which could easily have happened here in the South and during the American Revolution. Washington was determined to beat the British at their own game, to also play European war, and to show America could produce troops as fine as any of those produced in Europe. The resulting victory was therefore a mixture of militia and unconventional warfare and utterly conventional warfare. But what was important was that the cohesion of the society to a large extent survived, even though you can find this civil war playing itself out in the northern states and here in the South long after the American Revolution. And then I'm going to just say, finally, I was talking to a group, and this was sponsored by the President and the State Department, a major initiative for young African leaders to come to America. And what was fascinating to them is, why did your Constitution survive? Why did this country, the great problem, and we've seen it in Russia, we've seen it in many countries, is that the Constitution gets written and then some guy decides he wants to be in power for a long time. And I said, and this was always my favorite argument, the great thing was that in Philadelphia, they elected a convention. They didn't ask the legislature, the Congress, to write its own blank note. That's always disastrous with politicians. They elected a convention who would go do nothing but write the Constitution. Some of them former politicians, some just lawyers, some ex-veterans, but they were not writing their own blank check. They were thinking of what would be the ideal form of government. And then someone said to me afterwards, we did that in my country, but the military took over. And I suddenly thought I need to teach this differently, because really the major key was Washington's decision to step down as commander-in-chief, to accept that the military was subordinate to the civilians. He diffused what was a potential mutiny of the office corps at Newburgh that happened after Yorktown, and his decision to be the Cincinnatus of the American Revolution, named after the famous Roman commander who stepped down and simply tilled his farm in retirement. And then, of course, Washington's willingness to come back into office, to give the Constitution his support, and to act as the first president against really his private wishes. But what Washington and many veterans had recognized is the revolution had nearly come unstuck by its own anti-government rhetoric. It nearly went bankrupt because they couldn't tax. They needed a more powerful central government, and Washington played a key role in that as well. He's not obviously the only reason, but he's pretty important and is one example of how an individual, a leader, can indeed play a major role in history. Thank you. I think I'm afraid I've gone a bit beyond the hour, but I think I don't mind. Some people may need to go, but if there's some questions, I think we could take a few minutes. I don't know. What I'd love to do, if possible, is just show the YouTube at the very end of John Adams being presented to George III. If anyone knows how we could get that up, it would be a great way to end, because unlike the Patriot, this was from the John Adams series. And that encounter, and if you can't see it tonight, watch it on YouTube. That encounter is based on John Adams's written account of the dialogue between him and George III that he sent the next day. The meeting, incidentally, was at St. James's Palace.
Andrew, I'll echo that recommendation. I don't believe there's wireless in this building.
All right. I don't know if I've got the embedded.
You could
Yeah.
Google that, I imagine.
No.
And get it on YouTube.
Yeah, you can. It's not a problem.
Leave it up there and the people
Yes.
can remember it.
All right.
And they can go on, but they get, just
Yes.
one of those times. that you
Right.
do. Okay. Let's take just about 5 minutes of questions.
Yes.
And we'll break for
Excellent.
reception.
Yes.
We'd always heard that George III was a little
Mad. Yes.
later.
And, you know, that was part of the film, The Madness of King George. There was a mother and son psychiatry team who looked into the evidence. They were the first to go through all the doctor's notes. And they came up with a view, a highly defensible view, that actually he was suffering from porphyria, which was rather like haemophilia. It was very common in royal families and families that had intermarried a great deal. And the characteristics of it were madness. But the person was not actually clinically insane. They would indeed ramble. They had all the symptoms, but actually they went through very long periods of absolute sanity. This was a blood disorder. And there was one very telling characteristic, which was the color of the urine. And one doctor recognized this and kept recording that he had a bluish purple urine. And I had a chemist at my last university, and it became the rage to do interdisciplinary teaching. And he said, I would really like to talk about the chemistry of porphyria, and I'd like you to do the case study of George III. And I thought this was a great idea, and I would get marks from the dean for doing it. But I hadn't known what his title would be, and he was a very strict Methodist. So I'd never suspected that he would come up with a title like this. It was Purple Pea in the American Revolution. Incidentally, on virtually the first night of the madness of King George, in England it was the madness of King George III. They left off the 3 in America, and this is true, and you've probably heard it before because people would think they'd missed part 1 and 2. But Hawthorne collapsed on stage. He was ill. And the doctor ran forward to look after the main actor. And the doctor identified himself as the direct descendant of the doctor who identified the color of the urine and had been the one who'd been most attentive to George III and suspected it was something other than madness. But the consequence, he had his fatal attack in 1789, just before the French Revolution. He recovered, and so the film has an upbeat end. But he later came down with it permanently in 1810. He was removed as king. His son ruled in his place as Prince Regent. George III did not die till 1820, outlived them all. But the last 10 years of his life, he was essentially strapped to a chair and lived like a prisoner. Even his wife, Queen Charlotte, after whom Charlottesville and Charlotte are named, even she stopped visiting him, even though they'd been a very close couple. And one of the odd things about George III, he was a very moralistic individual and very religious. Although Horace Walpole, who was the great wit of the time, said that this is a very religious man in a very uncharitable way. Yes?
You made reference to the Howe. I believe one of the Howes allowed him to, Washington to escape, basically to get off of Manhattan Island. Was
Yes.
it partly because of the fact that they, I understand, were more interested in trying to negotiate?
Well, that is one of the theories. The Howes really spent a lot of time. It was the only face-to-face meeting between American and British representatives was on Staten Island. It does, though, I think, get rather overemphasized. It's very significant to me that it's really the older brother, the Admiral, who was keen on negotiating. He came with ships with names like Friendship. He was full of good will and bonhomie, and thought that if sensible people sat down, they could solve it. It's telling to me that while they were meeting on Staten Island, William was not present. William was about to invade Kip's Bay and attack Manhattan. I think what had unsettled William was commanding at Bunker Hill. The British were nearly defeated at Bunker Hill, and it was one of the largest loss of officers in any battle in British history. The casualty rate was terrible, and although the British technically won the battle and held the hill, it was at such cost. He realized that the British army was not well enough trained, which is why he took them off to Canada to do a lot more training. But more, he realized very quickly, as many of these people did, that these were not fools. This was not the kind of ramshackle civilian army that they'd been led to expect. And he therefore proceeded with caution. He almost undoubtedly believed that all it needed was continued pressure, that the threat of huge force was going to be enough for Washington's army to implode. And he was almost right. Once the British got into New Jersey, Washington was down to 2,000 men, half of whom at least were about to end their enlistments at the end of December of 1776. And it was Washington's counter-attack across the Delaware, which is deservedly regarded as iconic, because at that point morale was at its lowest. Washington himself said, "We're at our last tether." And he did the unthinkable, to go outside a campaign season with men without shoes, to cross ice, to go navigate across the river, and to attack the furthest extended British post, which happened to be manned by Hessian German soldiers, but not only to successfully take them, recross the Delaware, then come back and go round Cornwallis's army at night, like a scene from a movie. They muffled the wheels of the wagons, maneuvered around him at night, and attacked his rear. Clinton was outraged. I mean, he hated Cornwallis after the war, blamed him for everything, and said even the most idiotic corporal couldn't have been outdone. Lord George Germain at the time said this just is an act of desperation. And he was right. Washington was desperate. But as Napoleon said, don't give me good generals, give me successful generals. It succeeded, but it could easily have failed. Yes. Yeah. Oh, right, okay, yes.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, I have one little quibble. if I
Yes,
may.
yeah, I do.
As far as I know, New Hampshire was one of the original 13 colonies, and then later became one of the original 13 states under the Articles of Confederation. It was Vermont.
Yeah, you're right.
It was not a state, and did not become a state until 1793, at the same time as Kentucky.
I concede. And thank you for correcting me. There's always the danger. Thank you.
You were saying that the general in New York negotiating with Washington, but wasn't that really what Lord North probably wanted him to do?
Yeah. And interestingly, there wasn't a coherent British policy. The cabinet was split. There was Germain on the one hand who argued you've got to go in. Really, he had the Powell Doctrine, the Colin-Powell Doctrine, go in with massive force, get a quick victory, and then negotiate. And you had Lord North, who didn't want war, who wanted to negotiate, find a compromise, and North insisted that the Howes not only be given military power, but that they be made peace commissioners, and so that they could make offers and terms. But Germain undermined that to see that what terms they could offer were very limited. But that's a good point.
Well, let's continue the discussion
Yes.
during the reception, but I want to thank you so much for
Oh, well,
this
thank you.
wonderful
Right.
presentation. So thank you so much. It was very,
Excellent.
very well done. Very well done. Thank you.